I should warn you before we begin, nothing ruins a legend faster than the man who wrote the song explaining how it really happened. Still, you have come to listen, and I am too vain to refuse an audience. So let us sit, you and I, somewhere quiet. Imagine a fire between us, a jug of decent wine, and outside the window the wind carrying the distant clatter of an inn where younger bards are trying to rhyme destiny with misery. I prefer to speak softly, as one does when confessing the things that never made it into the ballads. My name is Dandelion. Yes, that Dandelion, the one your uncle cursed as a nuisance, your aunt sighed over in secret, and your local guard captain swore he would hang one day for unpaid tavern bills. For years I have followed a witcher named Geralt of Rivia, collecting stories, polishing them, and releasing them into the world dressed in melody and metaphor. You know some of those stories already, in their public, respectable form. What I offer you now is something different. Not another heroic saga, but a chain of nights and days when destiny turned almost silently, and I stood just close enough to feel the draught. When people speak of fate, they usually picture thunderbolts, prophecies shouted from mountaintops, or crowns dropping from heaven onto deserving brows. That makes for excellent theatre and dreadful truth. In my experience, destiny is much quieter. It slips into a crowded marketplace like a stranger in a plain cloak. It sits down at your table, asks for a sip of your wine, and by the time you realize you should have refused, your life has already rearranged itself around its presence. These tales are from the time of the Sword of Destiny, a fine, sonorous title. I did not invent it, more's the pity, but I have watched it follow Geralt like a shadow. You might think they are only about him, the white-haired witcher with the pale, unreadable eyes, the sorceress with the raven hair and sharp tongue, the child whose laughter sounded once like any other child's, and later like a question the whole world tried to answer. They stand at the center. Yet you might be surprised how much of their fate was witnessed, nudged, or endured by those who walked a step beside them. That is where I come in. I have been called many things: coward, fool, genius, scoundrel, friend. The truth, as usual, lies scattered somewhere between all of these. I was there on the dragon hunt, where men boasted of glory, and a certain mysterious gentleman laughed as if he knew the ending already. I lingered on the fringes of a love story made of shards and ice, where Geralt and a rival sorcerer stared at each other like two condemned men offered the same last wish. I watched a Doppler borrow faces in Novigrad and discover that humans change masks more easily than he ever could. And I stood by the sea while a girl named Essie sang her heart into the waves and pretended it was only a song. But there is more. In the deep forest of Brokilon, I saw a child with ashen hair look at Geralt, not with fear, not even with admiration, but with a recognition that chilled me more than any arrow. Later, when kings quarrelled and kingdoms burned, I held my friend's hand as he drifted between fever and memory, while the world outside his sickbed rearranged itself like pieces on a game board. You may ask why I, of all people, should be trusted to tell this story. A fair question. Bards are professional liars, after all, even when we insist we serve the truth. My answer is simple. Heroes rarely understand the tales they live through. Geralt would shrug and tell you it was all coincidence, contract work, and unfortunate timing. Yennefer would correct the adjectives, delete the tender moments, and leave you with something rehearsely intelligent and utterly incomplete. Ciri, if she were here, might begin to speak and then fall silent, as children do when they sense that adults are listening for the wrong things. I, on the other hand, stood beside them with no sword of my own, but a lute and a stomach unsuited to real heroism. I watched, listened, and survived long enough to grow older than the man I sang about. That gives a certain perspective. One sees what the protagonists miss while they are busy bleeding and choosing and regretting. Do not expect impartiality. I love them all in my own selfish, stumbling way. A storyteller cannot be neutral any more than a mirror can refuse to show the cracks in its own glass. What I can offer you instead is honesty about my dishonesty. When I embellish, I will do it out of habit, and then I will gently correct myself. When I soften a blow, I will admit that I am doing it for my own sake as much as for yours. And when, on rare occasions, I fall completely silent, you may take that as proof that no ballad could safely hold what really happened. So let this be our agreement. You will listen not for perfect accuracy, but for a kind of deeper truth, the one that hides between the official version and the things we never dared to sing on stage. These 15 nights together, we will walk through the stories of Geralt, Yennefer, Ciri, and the world that tried to claim them. Yet each turn in the road, each choice that seemed small at the time, will be seen from where I stood. At the crossroads, quill in hand, watching destiny choose its path. And in the quiet moments between one tale and the next, when the fire burns low, and even the most stubborn insomniac feels sleep tugging at their eyelids, we will pause to ask ourselves a simple question. If destiny is a sword, are we the ones who wield it, or are we merely the fingers trying not to bleed as we hold on? The jug is full, the night is long, and the road of memory stretches out before us like a song waiting to be sung. Let us begin with a mountain, a dragon, and a man who insisted he did not believe in fate, even as fate was already climbing the path to meet him. I remember the first time I heard the word dragon that season, not on a stage, but in a smoky inn whose shutters rattled with every gust from the mountains. A courier burst in, mud on his cloak, and asked for ale before breath. Only after draining his cup did he shout that King Nedemir was offering a rich reward to those who would help rid his realm of a dragon. The room woke at once. Nothing sobers men like the thought of gold wrapped in glory. Geralt sat in a corner, hands around his mug, hood pushed back just enough to watch the door. Most patrons took him for another mercenary. I saw something else. The small, controlled frown that appears whenever people speak lightly about killing monsters they have never seen. My own reaction was less restrained. Dragon hunts are the raw material of legends. Fire against steel. Banners in the wind. A grateful king. I slid closer on the bench. Think of the song, I murmured. You, the dragon, the king's court. It practically writes itself. Geralt regarded me for a moment, then shrugged. We will see, he said. Within days, the road toward the mountains filled with hopeful travellers. Every village had its own would-be slayer polishing his helmet and explaining to anyone who would listen why destiny had clearly chosen him. Merchants rattled off prices for dragon teeth and scales. Priests muttered about purifying the land. I watched them with professional interest. the way a cook eyes ingredients before deciding what sort of stew might be possible. It was on that road that we met Borsch 3 Jackdaws. We found him on a wooden bridge, occupying a table as if it were his personal balcony over the river. Boots up, cloak thrown back, he looked like a man who trusted the world to arrange itself comfortably around him. 2 Zerricanian women stood at his shoulders, warriors whose stillness carried more threat than any shouted challenge. Most men in his position would have tried to impress us. Borch only smiled as if he had been expecting our arrival. He invited us to join his meal. Geralt accepted with a nod. The Zerricanians measured him with quick, expert glances. I followed automatically. A bard who refuses free food is a contradiction in terms. From the first cup of wine, it was clear that Borch was not simply another treasure-seeker. He asked Geralt about his work, but without the usual curiosity about blood and scars. Instead, he listened when Geralt mentioned almost casually that witches did not hunt dragons. They were rare, intelligent, and not the sort of threat his profession was meant to address. I had heard that opinion before. It was part of the private code that guided the hand which held those 2 swords. What struck me was the way Borch responded. He did not argue or laugh. He simply watched Geralt with sudden intensity, as if some inner calculation had just given him the answer he needed. We reached Njedemir's encampment a few days later. Around the king's pavilion clustered a familiar assortment, a renowned sorceress studying the mountains like an equation, a dwarven company led by a veteran who cared more about fair pay than noble speeches, a shining knight whose polish outstripped his experience, heralds and scribes already rehearsing the announcement of victory. If you have ever seen villagers arguing over the last sack of grain before winter, you know the heart of a dragon hunt. Replace the sack with a hoard, the barn with a royal tent, and the conversation remains the same. Who has done the most? Who deserves the largest share? Who is thinking only of the common good, and not at all of their own purse? I did what bards do. I sang in the evenings, praised the king's wisdom and the bravery of his champions, and left spaces in my verses so I could fill in names later depending on who survived. Around us, the camp buzzed. Men argued about tactics and routes. Cooks stirred kettles. Geralt moved through it all like a craftsman at a masquerade. He knew that this dragon, perched in the high rocks, threatened pride more than people. Kings, sorcerers, and ambitious knights had come to measure themselves against a legend. He listened, asked little, and weighed everyone's reasons as he might weigh a contract on a village ghoul. Borch, however, fit no familiar pattern. He spoke to dwarves like an old comrade, to nobles as if their titles were costumes, and to me with a gentle amusement that never felt cruel. Most of all, he sought Geralt's company, turning conversations toward questions of principle. Which creatures deserved death? Which could be spared, when a sword should be sheathed even if the law allowed it to be drawn? On the last night before the ascent, the camp almost looked festive. Fires burned in scattered rings of light. Someone roasted meat. Someone else gambled away his imagined share of the hoard. Laughter rose easily, though it faltered whenever eyes strayed toward the dark outline of the mountain. I sat by our fire, lute across my knees. Geralt turned the whetstone in his hands. Borch leaned back, gazing at the peaks. The Zerricanians oiled their blades with the calm of people long acquainted with danger. What each of us wanted from the dragon was not the same. The king wanted safety and a triumphant proclamation. The sorceress wanted rare knowledge. The dwarves wanted pay and a chance to prove that their steel still meant something. I wanted a story grand enough to be sung in every court from here to the sea. Geralt, I suspected, wanted to prevent a slaughter that need not happen. As for Borch, I could only guess. Yet we are left to wonder whether it was ever truly the dragon that stood in the greatest peril, or whether the real danger waited in what we would discover about ourselves once we stood close enough to see our reflections in its eyes. At dawn, the fires would be stamped out, straps tightened, armor buckled. We would begin the climb, each step carrying us away from boasting and toward truth. At the time, I still thought I was simply gathering material for another glorious ballad. I did not yet understand that some encounters do not ask to be turned into songs. They ask instead to change the singer. Morning on the mountain tasted of stone and thin fear. King Nedemir's banner snapped in the wind above a line of armoured men and hired blades, all pretending not to notice how the path dropped away into mist at their boots. Dawn makes everything look noble for a moment. It washed even the greediest faces with soft gold, so that, at a glance, we might have passed for pilgrims on a holy road, instead of rivals climbing toward a purse of coin and a tale. We set out in a broken procession, dwarves grumbling about footing, nobles comparing crests, mercenaries counting imagined shares aloud. I rode as close to Geralt as the trail allowed, trying not to look down. The higher we climbed, the more the world below dissolved into cloud. Only rock, sky, and the single-file path remained. You would be surprised how quickly chatter dies when one careless step can turn bravado into an echo. Somewhere above us, veiled by cloud and cliff, waited the dragon. Men craned their necks as if it might courteously present itself on a nearby ridge. Wagers passed from hand to hand, colour, size, how many burns a man could survive and still boast over ale. Geralt did not join in. His eyes moved over scree, snow, and faint scorches on stone. Witches do not speculate where they can observe. Whatever he read there tightened his jaw. Borch 3. Jackdaws, on the other hand, climbed as if strolling through a city park. He moved with unforced ease, pausing to point out loose stones or offer a steady hand to someone whose courage wobbled at a bad moment. The Zerricanian women shadowed him, silent and watchful. When a pack animal faltered near a bend, they caught the reins in a blur of motion. Their efficiency made the rest of us look like clumsy tourists. We paused at a ledge wide enough for a brief camp. Clouds swirled below like a second inverted sky. Nedemir sent scouts ahead to find the lair, while arguments resumed around us. Who would strike the killing blow? Who had the right to claim the head? Whether a witcher counted as a knight or merely as complicated equipment. Listening to them, I began to suspect the hunt was less about a dragon than about everyone's reflection in the story that would follow. The scouts returned sooner than expected, their faces telling us more than their words. They spoke of a ravine, a rockfall, and a shape on a ledge that failed to match their favourite tavern paintings. Geralt questioned them quietly, the way a doctor questions a patient, leaving out awkward symptoms. Whatever he pieced together only deepened his unease. We moved on anyway. Pride has its own gravity. Once a crowd begins to ascend toward promised glory, it is hard to ask it to turn back, because reality has become inconvenient. The path narrowed further. We dismounted and led the horses. At one cruel turn, a laden animal slipped and vanished with a brief cry. Rope snapped, metal clattered on distant stone. Then nothing. For a heartbeat, we all stood still, counting the cost. Then someone shrugged that it was only luggage, and the hunt continued. Only luggage. Only a beast. Only a life. Such small words we use when we wish to walk lightly over heavy truths. Near midday, we heard the first roar. It rolled down the mountainside like trapped thunder. Some men crossed themselves. Others grinned as if the sound itself were a promise of fame. A dragon's cry, they said. At last. I glanced at Geralt. He listened as one musician listens to another, and shook his head. That is not a challenge, he said. It is a warning. Warnings matter only to those willing to be warned. The company pressed on until the ravine opened below us, and the lair finally came into view. The dragon lay on a broad rock shelf, scales catching the sun in muted metallic shades. Not the bright green of tavern walls, but a blend of old gold and weathered brass, like autumn leaves in late afternoon. Wings folded, head raised, it watched us with the stillness of something that has lived long enough to grow tired of surprises. What truly broke the pattern, however, were the humans clustered at its side. Refugees, by their look. Villagers who had fled rumors of a beast only to end up under its protection. Their presence shattered the simple picture everyone had carried up the slope. This was no clean scene of monster versus righteous champions. It was a knot in which fear, need, and survival had tangled beyond our neat categories. Voices rose at once. Some demanded that the dragon be slain regardless. Others hesitated, seeing the families huddled there. The sorceress argued for caution, for study. The dwarves muttered that none of this complicated morality appeared in their contract. Niedemir's people kept glancing at their young king, reading his pride as if it were a map. Borch watched in silence. So did Geralt. For a moment, the two of them seemed oddly alike to me, men who understood that the next choice would reveal more than any songs already forming in other minds. When the dragon's nature finally became impossible to deny, everyone on that ledge faced the same question. Some reached for steel, some for doctrine. Geralt stepped forward instead, placing himself between raised weapons and the creature that had harmed no one there. His swords stayed at his back. He spoke not to greed or fear, but to whatever remained of conscience in those listening, reminding them that not every threat grants us the right to become worse than the thing we confront. Borch moved to stand with him. In that single gesture, all his earlier jokes and mysteries rearranged themselves. He was no longer simply a stranger with fine taste in wine. He was someone who measured worth by loyalty, not by decree, and who was willing to stake his life on that measurement. As for me, I would love to tell you that I rushed to their side driven by pure moral clarity. The truth is smaller and perhaps more human. I hesitated. I thought of songs, of patrons, of how difficult it is to perform in cities where kings believe you stood against them. Then I thought of Geralt, who had more than once stood between me and danger I had richly earned. My feet moved before my doubts finished speaking. Later, I took comfort in that. In the clash that followed, one fact burned brighter to me than any spurting flame. The so-called monster showed more restraint and care than many of the supposed heroes. It shielded the defenseless at its side. It fought only when pressed. It weighed every life on that ledge as if each were a coin of equal value. Not everyone surrounding me could claim the same. Looking back, I recognize this day as a decisive crack in the glass of all the old tales I had grown up repeating. Stories where beasts are always beasts, kings always shining, mercenaries always expendable. Neat roles make neat rhymes. Reality on that mountain refused to cooperate. And so we are left to wonder whether the label monster truly belongs by nature to those born with scales and wings, or whether it sometimes fits more tightly around the hearts of those who climb toward a kill, with their hands already measuring the weight of the reward. There are winters that arrive on the calendar and winters that arrive in the heart. The one I am about to describe never showed itself as snow in the streets where I walked. It formed instead between three people already too entangled for comfort: Geralt, Yennefer, and a sorcerer named Istred. I did not witness their triangle directly. Wizards like their cities, high, cold, and full of secrets, which makes them inconvenient for bards with average lungs and a dislike of magical politics. But news travels toward me, especially when it smells of love, pride, and impending disaster. It began for me with a letter from Yennefer. That alone was unusual. She preferred to appear in doorways rather than on parchment, bringing perfume, sarcasm, and trouble in roughly equal measure. Her handwriting was as sharp as her voice, the ink biting into the page. She wrote from a city of towers and ice. She did not describe the scenery. Yennefer rarely wasted ink on landscapes. Instead, she mentioned spells, research, and the fact that she was indisposed for a time, alongside a casual reference to an old colleague, Istred, with whom she was collaborating. The sentence about him was so neutral it might as well have been written in snow. That, more than anything, made me suspicious. When a woman like Yennefer writes neutrally about a man, there is either nothing to say or far too much. The next time I saw Geralt, I asked about Istred. "A mage," he said. "Obviously," I replied. "Does he also breathe, eat, and own at least one impressive robe?" Geralt ignored the joke and stared into the distance. He did that more often when speaking of her. Finally he added, "We have met." It was not much, but the pause told me more than a tavern full of gossip. Something had happened in that distant city of ice, something that left no visible scar on Geralt's skin, yet made him stand as if new weight hung from his shoulders. Merchant caravans brought the rest. They spoke of a witcher seen in the wizard city, of hushed arguments in narrow streets, of a stoic man and a dark-haired sorceress locked in conversations that looked less like quarrels and more like negotiations over invisible boundaries. And there was mention of Istred, a scholar of stones and ancient things, not the sort of mage who sets fire to crowds for amusement, but one whose loyalty to his city was matched only by his long, quiet history with Yennefer. Here is what emerged, pieced together from rumours, confessions, and the silences between them. Geralt arrived in that city not by accident, but because Yennefer asked him to come. That in itself mattered. She was not a woman who requested company lightly, least of all from someone who unsettled her as much as he steadied her. Yet when he arrived, he discovered that he was not the only man who believed he had a claim on her affections. Istred, with his library, his stonework, and his long years of shared study, stood beside her as confidently as any knight beside his lady. Their past was not a youthful whim. It was chain of habits, conversations, and compromises, forged slowly over time. Geralt, whose life had taught him that everything is temporary, watched two people who had invested in permanence. Istred, who measured the world in layers of rock and years of excavation, watched a man who lived as if tomorrow might be his last contract. Between them stood Yennefer, who wanted impossibly to be both rooted and free. In my mind's eye, I still see the three of them in a single room. A table, a window crusted with frost, a small fire fighting against the cold. Geralt stands near the wall, arms folded, more ready for a verdict than a conversation. Istred sits by the desk, fingers stained with ink, used to debating with words rather than steel. And Yennefer moves between them, her eyes calculating the exact distance at which none of them will break. There was, I am told, a moment when she asked them both to decide. Not which of them loved her most, because such questions produce only lies and melodrama, but which of them was willing to live with the full truth of who she was. The sorcerer who had known her longest believed his history with her granted a certain inevitability. The witcher, who trusted almost nothing else, believed in the sincerity of his feelings in the present. Each man thought he understood her best. Each was wrong in his own way. When people hear of this, they often ask on whose side I stand. Should Yennefer have chosen the man who shared her world of study and influence, or the one who saw in her a fierce, flawed miracle? Should Geralt have walked away rather than demand what she might never be able to give? Should Istred have surrendered gracefully instead of fighting for a future built over years? I am a bard. My allegiance is to complexity. Standing outside that frozen triangle, I felt less anger than sorrow. Love, in theory, is the warmest of human inventions. In practice, it so often crystallizes around fear. Fear of being abandoned, of being insufficient, of being known too well. When next I met Yennefer, she did not describe what had transpired. She only said that things had been decided and that, for the moment, the matter was closed. Her eyes, however, carried the weary brightness of someone who has won an argument and lost something unnamed in the process. Geralt would only grunt if I probed, turning the subject as a swordsman turns aside a clumsy blow. From Istred, I never heard a word. In the end, the stories that circulated were simpler. Some said the witcher walked away triumphant, others that the mage did. Each version trimmed inconvenient emotions, smoothed jagged choices, and assigned clear winners and losers. None of them, I think, were true. The reality lived in half-remembered phrases, in the way Yennefer started and stopped when certain topics arose, in the new caution with which Geralt approached every possibility of happiness afterward. I sometimes imagine an alternate version of that winter, one where they all sat down, confessed their fears with clumsy honesty, and found some gentle, untidy arrangement that did not require ultimatums. But if they had been those sorts of people, they would not be the same figures who stride so vividly through the rest of this story. Heroes, lovers, sorcerers, witches, none of them excel at gentle compromise. And so we are left to wonder whether what we call mature love is truly wisdom hard won, or whether it is often just a more elegant way of arranging the shards of our fear so they cut less visibly, even as they continue to pierce us from within. If the story of that winter ended with a single choice neatly made, I could close the chapter here and move on. Listeners like clean conclusions. This one stayed, that one left. Hearts broke, lessons were learned. But love, and whatever crooked cousin of love bound Geralt and Yennefer together, refuses such obedience. Their decision in that city of ice solved less than it unsettled. Winter yielded to other seasons, yet the frost beneath their feet never melted entirely. I first saw the aftermath one damp evening in a roadside inn whose roof leaked in 3 different places. Geralt arrived late, cloak spattered with mud, eyes shadowed not by lack of sleep, but by thoughts he did not want. People imagine witches striding through storms untouched. They forget that water soaks even enchanted leather, and doubt seeps through any armor given enough time. He dropped his saddlebags, sat, and accepted wine without complaint. This was already a warning sign. Geralt normally treated tavern wine as a personal insult. I asked about contracts, monsters, the usual. He answered briefly, politely, as one does when humouring a persistent child. Only when Yennefer's name drifted close to the surface of our conversation did his expression shift, not toward anger, but toward a kind of careful emptiness. "It is settled," he said. What it encompassed, he did not elaborate. Perhaps they had agreed to try again, perhaps to part, perhaps to leave the decision in some limbo that felt safer than either commitment or goodbye. Witches live by the blade, sorcerers by will. Neither vocation encourages the slow, clumsy negotiations that real relationships demand. We travelled together for a time. On certain nights, when the fire burned low, he would take something from his pouch and turn it over in his fingers. A small object that caught the light on its sharp edges. A shard of something once whole, now refracting the flames into fractured colours. He never explained where it came from. I never asked. Some symbols introduce themselves without words. In taverns along the road, I heard alternate versions of the tale. Mages love to gossip. Their apprentices love it more. In one city, they said that Yennefer had chosen the Witcher and laughed as the scholar watched her go, humiliated. In another, that she had finally grown tired of Geralt's wandering and returned sensibly to her old companion, leaving the Witcher to brood in a snowstorm. Each city tailored the story to its own preference. Those who distrusted magic favoured Geralt. Those who admired towers and libraries favoured Istred. None of them considered that all 3 might have lost more than they gained. I wrote songs, of course. How could I not? A bard is a scavenger of emotion, picking through the remains of other people's experiences for melodies. Yet, whenever I tried to set this particular entanglement to music, the rhymes came out false. I could craft a ballad where Yennefer was cruel, or another where Geralt was blind, or one in which Istred's scholarly pride ruined everything. All were plausible. None were honest. What I saw from my safe distance was not a wicked woman toying with hearts, nor 2 men competing for a prize. I saw 3 people, all wounded in different ways long before they met each other. trying to use love as a salve, and discovering that it stung like alcohol poured into an unhealed cut. Yennefer, denied the simple ability to bear children, carried a wound that no spell could erase. She wanted control over her life so fiercely that any hint of dependence looked like a threat. Geralt, made sterile and altered by mutagens, knew in his bones that he was unnatural, set apart. He longed to be accepted without illusion, yet flinched whenever someone came too close. Istred, human and aging, looked at sorcerers and witches alike, and saw beneath his fascination the reminder that he would one day crumble to dust while they walked on. The three of them reached for one another from these distances. Some days, perhaps, they succeeded. More often, they collided and recoiled, like magnets flipped the wrong way. Later, when I asked Yennefer obliquely whether she regretted what had happened, she smiled in that terrifyingly calm way of hers. "Regret is for those who believe they had better options," she said. It sounded sharp and decisive, the sort of line you might embroider on the banner of a proud independence. Yet her gaze drifted, just for an instant, toward a window where children played in the street. Their laughter rose and fell like the sound of a tide that never reached her shore. Geralt, for his part, behaved afterward as if the whole episode had been a technical misunderstanding. He buried himself in work, in contracts, in the comfortingly simple logic of danger and coin. Yet there were changes one noticed if one knew him well. He grew warier of staying anywhere too long. Offers of warmth, be they a lover's embrace or a peasant family's gratitude, made him uncomfortable. He would accept, then leave sooner than he needed to, as if fearing that his presence might break something just by enduring. Istred vanished into his city. Mages do that. They retreat into towers, lectures, and stones older than kingdoms. From time to time, a rumor would surface that he was excavating ruins in the east, that he had published some treatise on magical sediment, that he had refused a prestigious position because it would have required leaving his beloved city. His name became one more stone in the wall of Yennefer's past, too solid to move, too heavy to carry everywhere. What remained between them all was not resolution, but residue, a faint, persistent ache, like the memory of a bitter winter in the joints. They moved owner, so they said. They fought dragons, negotiated with queens, survived riots and wars. Yet some part of each decisive act was coloured by the knowledge that when they had been asked to choose love, they had discovered that love itself was not a single, simple door to be opened or closed, but a corridor of mirrors in which one sees too much of oneself. From the outside, people spoke as if the question were straightforward. Whom should Yennefer have chosen? As if the answer might reveal the right way to love, pinned like a butterfly in a glass case. From where I stood, watching them stumble through their separate paths, the more haunting question was different. What if the problem was not whom they loved, but the way each of them had been taught to think about love as victory, as possession, as a test of worthiness, until the very thing that should have healed them became another battlefield. And so we are left to wonder whether our insistence on making love tidy and decisive does not itself become a kind of cruelty, forcing us to cut away any tender, ambiguous truth that does not fit into the sharp little stories we tell ourselves to sleep at night. Some cities encourage you to show who you are, Novigrad was proud of insisting the opposite. Under its painted saints and clean facades, the real law was simple: wear the right mask, and no one asks what lies beneath. Priests of the eternal fire marched about preaching purity while moneylenders counted coin behind their backs. It was the perfect city to meet someone who could change faces for real. We arrived in late autumn. Smoke lay over the rooftops. The canals smelled of tar and fish, and the temple bell cut the day into obedient pieces. I came to find patrons. Geralt came to find work. Neither of us imagined we would instead find a dispute over who had the right to be a halfling. We heard him first in a tavern by the gate. A small man stood on a table, papers in hand, shouting that he had been stolen. "My name," he cried. "My seal, my wagons. Someone is walking around this city as Dainty Bibervelt and doing business in my place." Even in Novigrad, this was unusual. Men lose horses, fortunes, and reputations every day. Losing your entire identity while still very much alive was a new refinement. "Only here," I murmured to Geralt, "does a man arrive to find he is already ruining his own credit. Curiosity is a professional hazard for bards and a mild illness for witches." We followed the commotion to a customs yard. There, between wagons and scribbling clerks, we found the heart of the matter. Two dainty Bibervelts standing face to face. Same build, same voice, same indignant tilt of the eyebrows. They accused each other of fraud with identical gestures, like mirror images arguing about which one was real. The guards, lacking training in metaphysics, decided to let the eternal fire sort it out. An official arrived in spotless robes, sniffed the air as if heresy had a smell, and began to question both halflings. Papers were examined, signatures compared. To a casual eye, they were perfectly alike. But a bard lives by timing, and I noticed a fractional hesitation in the calmer Dainty's answers, as though he were finding memories that did not quite fit his mouth. Geralt noticed more. Witches are taught to recognize monsters, but no one had warned him what to do when the supposed monster is paying taxes and arguing about tariffs. Later, away from priests and guards, we cornered the calmer halfling in an empty warehouse. When he realized there was no audience left to fool, he let the disguise fall. His body shuddered, blurred at the edges, and the halfling shape softened as if melted by invisible heat. In its place stood a thin grey figure with wide, uncertain eyes, and features that seemed to be still deciding on their final form. He told us he was a Doppler. On roads and in villages he had worn many shapes: dog, beggar, nameless worker. Each life had ended the same way, under kicks, curses, or threats. Then he met Dainty. He saw how people greeted the merchant, how doors opened, how even guards stepped aside. For the first time, he said, he had seen a life in which existing did not automatically mean running. "So I tried being him," the Doppler admitted. "I did not only steal, I traded, I bargained, I made his fortune grow." When the real Dainty heard the full story, his fury shifted. Outrage at violation mixed with reluctant admiration. The contracts the Doppler had signed were risky but clever. With careful work, they might leave the halfling richer than before. The trouble was that all this success had been built on fraud committed by a creature the eternal fire would happily burn on principle. The official wanted a pure ending, burn the monster, restore the name, write a sermon. But Novigrad's soul is split between altar and counting house. Once Dainty understood how much money hung in the balance, he argued that killing the Doppler would be bad for business. Better to make him clean up the mess he had made. So we all sat around a scarred table and negotiated with a being most of the city would not admit could think. The Doppler promised to work under Dainty's supervision, help untangle the accounts and repay what he could. In public, he would be introduced as an assistant. In private, he would be the mind behind half the ledger. The priest, forced to choose between doctrine and a prosperous merchant's favour, chose the oldest middle road. He called the arrangement penance, signed the papers, and resolved to speak about something simpler in his next sermon. By evening, the Doppler had something he had never possessed before, a fragile, conditional right to remain. Not safety, not in Novigrad, not with the eternal fire watching, but an agreement that he could live so long as he continued to make other people richer. Later, Geralt and I sat on a rooftop watching the streets below. Lanterns burned along the docks. The bell of the temple boomed over the water. On a corner we saw Dainty and his double walking side by side, arguing over figures in a book. From that height they were identical. You could have taken his head to the priest, I said. You would have been paid, praised, and invited to dinner. Geralt watched the two halflings vanish into the maze of streets. I did not see a monster, he answered. Only someone tired of being hunted for existing. His words lodged somewhere between my ribs. I thought of my own masks, the roles I wore in courts and taverns, the polished Dandelion who never showed fear or doubt. I could remove those costumes at any time and still be treated as a man. The Doppler had to become someone else entirely, just to be allowed to buy bread without risk. We like to pretend that we value truth in people, that consistency is a virtue. Yet, in cities like Novigrad, it is the adaptable who prosper, the ones who can forget yesterday's opinions, rewrite their past, and present whichever face the moment demands. A Doppler is simply an honest exaggeration of that human talent, and that is why he frightens us. As we rode away from Novigrad, the bells fading behind us, I found myself wondering how many citizens had quietly stolen names, stories, and lives in ways that would never light the pyres. They would not be called monsters. They would be called respectable. And so we are left to wonder whether the true danger lies with the rare creature who can shift his flesh, or with our own easy habit of shifting conscience and memory, until even we can no longer say with certainty which of our many faces has ever really been our own. We left Novigrad with more coin in our purses and less certainty in our hearts. The eternal fire's bells faded behind us, but the image of two identical halflings did not. On the road, when conversation lulled, I kept seeing that moment when the Doppler's borrowed body shimmered and the tidy shell of Dainty Bibervelt flowed away, leaving something nakedly unsure beneath. Admit it, I told Geralt one afternoon as we followed a rutted track between muddy fields. You liked him? Geralt gave me the sort of look usually reserved for men who think they can best him at dice. I did not dislike him, he said. From Geralt, that was practically an ode. What unsettled me was not the Doppler's grey flesh or shifting bones. A travelling bard sees enough monsters in the faces of drunken patrons. No, what gnawed at me was how quickly we all adjusted our judgment once his imitation began to benefit the original. A creature who had been a fiend when skulking in gutters became a resource the moment his forged contracts promised profit. If you want to know a city's soul, do not listen to its hymns. Listen to its bargains. In the villages we passed afterward, I started noticing quieter metamorphoses. A farmhand who flattened his country accent for a passing noble, a widow who put on a pious face for the priest and another for the miller, a tax collector who condemned dishonest men at the tavern, and later that same evening accepted a bribe with the weary grace of a man accepting an unavoidable tip. None of these people were Dopplers. They did not alter bone and skin, yet each bent themselves, a little or a lot, to fit expectations. Watching them, I felt again that queasy recognition. It was not the shapeshifter in Novigrad who was strange, but his honesty. He changed to survive, and did not pretend otherwise. "Is it lying," I asked Geralt one night by the campfire, "if the mask fits better than the face underneath?" He looked up from the whetstone sliding along his blade. "For who?" he said. "For anyone," I answered. "For our halfling friend, for the priest who chose profit over doctrine. For me, when I sing the sort of songs that open doors and leave the truer ones in my notebook." Geralt stared into the flames a moment. "You are asking the wrong Witcher," he replied. "I was altered so thoroughly that there is no before to compare to. I should have let it go, but the Doppler's uncertainty would not leave me. 'There is still a boy from somewhere inside you,' I said, 'even if you pretend otherwise.'" He said nothing, but his eyes flickered. For a Witcher, that is almost a confession. We met the Doppler again once, weeks later, on a road curling away from the city, whose walls had nearly been his pyre. He wore the face of a nondescript trader, the sort you forget as soon as he passes. Only when we shared a bench at a roadside inn did he approach, revealing himself with a small tilt of the head and the careful politeness of the truly frightened. "Tell me," he asked, voice low, "how long must I do the right thing before people stop seeing me as what I was?" Geralt is not equipped for such questions. His life is built from contracts. You pay, he kills, matters end. There is no rate card for redemption. Still, he tried. "Longer than you think," he said. "Shorter than forever." The Doppler nodded as if that were enough. Perhaps, in its way, it was. I watched him that evening. He laughed too quickly, agreed too readily, as if following an invisible guide to respectable behaviour. When he slipped, it was not toward monstrosity, but toward honesty. A gesture too fluid, a glance too observant, a silence that lasted one heartbeat longer than manners require. He was learning to pretend to be what others already pretended to be without effort. The comfort of pretending is obvious. Masks save us from immediate danger. A Doppler avoids the stake. A bard avoids the displeasure of a patron. A Witcher avoids questions about fear by narrowing his answers to grunts. The city applauds these masks so long as they maintain order and profit. It is easier to govern shapes than souls. The cost is subtler. One day you realize you have performed the role so well for so long that you no longer know what you would do if no one were watching. I have seen it happen to courtiers who cannot laugh unless a higher-ranking noble laughs first, to priests who no longer know whether they believe their own sermons, to sorcerers who spend decades declaring they feel nothing until the lie has hollowed them out, and feeling itself becomes difficult. Thinking of him, I inevitably thought of myself. I too have a practiced shape. Dandelion the carefree, Dandelion the incorrigible, Dandelion whose only loyalty is to the next good song. It is a profitable fiction. Audiences welcome it. Innkeepers forgive it. Ladies are amused by it. Yet there are nights when, alone with my reflection in some dented piece of polished metal, I am not entirely sure where the act ends and the man begins. Perhaps that is why the Doppler's question has clung to me. I do not know how long one must do the right thing to outgrow a past shape. I only know that guilt and suspicion measure time differently, and that the people most determined to remind you who you were often have the least interest in who you are trying to become. And so we are left to wonder whether a life built on careful pretending can ever become truly our own, or whether the comfort of our chosen masks will always carry. Beneath their smooth surface, the slow, aching pressure of a self that remembers it was once allowed to be honest, if only for a brief evening in a Novigrad warehouse, or on a lonely road between fading bells and an uncertain future. The sea has its own way of tuning a man. After a few days on the coast, you start walking to the rhythm of waves, speaking in the pauses between gull cries. For a bard, it is both a blessing and a threat. Too much time by the water, and you begin to suspect that all your careful rhymes are just foam that the tide will wipe clean by morning. We came to that little coastal town because Geralt had been promised coin and I had been promised an audience. The contract concerned merpeople and fishermen, nets torn in the night, a war brewing between those who lived on the sand and those who lived beneath the waves. It sounded suitably exotic. I pictured shimmering tales, moonlit coves, and a grateful community raising us on their shoulders after we negotiated peace. Instead, we found a harbour that smelled of rot and salt, a tavern permanently damp, and a tangle of grievances so old that the youngest sailor could not remember how they had begun. Nets had been cut, boats overturned. The humans blamed the merfolk. The merfolk blamed the humans. Each side insisted the other had no right to exist where they had always existed. Into this walked a witcher, a bard, and a girl with a voice like morning light on water. Essie Davin arrived at the inn with her lute slung over her shoulder and her hair caught in a scarf the colour of sea glass. I had heard of her before, in snatches of praise and jealousy. Some called her Little Eye, because of a faint mark near her temple that did nothing to diminish the directness of her gaze. She met us as a colleague meets colleagues, with no fluttering or bowing, and when she smiled, something in my chest rearranged itself. It is a curious experience, meeting a younger version of yourself who is, in nearly every way, better. Essie sang with a clarity I had never mastered. Her fingers found harmonies I would have needed a week to compose. She listened when others spoke, truly listened, without calculating how best to turn their words into material. Yet I was not jealous. The realization came as a relief. She was not a rival in my story, but the main character of her own. Geralt, of course, noticed none of this. Or if he did, he tucked the observation away in some silent, unreachable drawer. He was busy mapping the currents between shore and sea, trying to discern who had truly started cutting nets and why. The local lord blamed beasts from below. The priest blamed sin, as priests often do when out of their depth. The fishermen blamed bad luck loudly and one another quietly. The truth, when it surfaced, was more tangled. There were merpeople angered by human expansion, humans angered by the loss of their catchers, and somewhere between them a single mermaid whose choice had turned personal grievance into communal conflict. She loved a human. The human was engaged to someone else. When you are young and in pain, it is easy to confuse the wound in your heart with the state of the entire world. Essie, with her sharp, empathetic eyes, understood this immediately. She spoke to the mermaid in the old tongue, coaxing out the story like a splinter from beneath skin. Later, when we sat together under the warped beams of the inn, she described the melancholy in the mermaid's gestures, the way she swam in circles when she mentioned the man, as if trapped in the orbit of a memory. "And you?" I asked, because bards are nosy by profession. "Have you ever loved anyone stupidly enough to threaten a war over it?" She laughed, but there was a catch in the sound. "Not a war," she said. "A few bad songs, perhaps." The bad songs came that night. Geralt, in the way of men who do not understand what they are doing, was kind to her. Not flirtatious, not calculating, only kind. He listened when she spoke about melodies. He thanked her when she translated for him. He treated her as an equal, which in our line of work is rarer than applause. I watched Essie watching him, watched the small softening of her features, the way she began to tune her strings to keys he favoured. I know the look of a heart quietly surrendering. I have seen it in mirrors. The negotiations between shore and sea grew more tense. There were meetings on the beach, voices raised above the crash of waves. Fishers demanded compensation. The merfolk demanded respect. The mermaid demanded, without saying it aloud, an impossible thing: that the man she loved should return her love and tear up the future he had promised elsewhere. In the end, the solution required sacrifice, as such solutions often do. I will not trace every detail. The story belongs as much to Essie and the mermaid as it does to Geralt. But I will tell you this: a heart was broken and did not crack loudly. It cracked in silence, in the quiet shift of acceptance on a young woman's face when she realized that no song, however beautiful, could make a witcher stay. Essie wrote later that her love for Geralt had been brief and foolish. I do not believe her. Brief, yes. Foolish, no. There is nothing foolish about recognizing something rare and reaching for it, even if your hand closes on air. The foolishness lies perhaps in believing that such an attempt will go unpunished. One evening by the sea, after the worst of the quarrels had been soothed and both humans and merfolk had agreed to try sharing the same waters again, we sat on the sand with our instruments. The tide hissed around our boots. The sky above us darkened from blue to the colour of old ink. Essie sang first. It was not a triumphant ballad about peace between species. It was a small song, delicate as a seashell, about a woman who turns into foam to spare the man she loves from making a cruel choice. The details differed from the real mermaid's fate, but the feeling beneath was the same. Loss, not as a grand tragedy, but as a quiet gift the world never acknowledges. Geralt listened with his head lowered. I watched the line of his mouth, the way his hands curled on his knees. Perhaps he understood, perhaps not. Witches are practiced at standing firm when others fall apart. They are less equipped to recognize someone else's internal unraveling when it comes without screams or blood. When she finished, Essie looked at him in a way that no audience would notice, but any bard would understand. A question lived in that gaze. Not a demand, not even a hope, just a fragile, wordless inquiry. Is there, somewhere in your path, a place where I might walk beside you for a while? Geralt's answer, as always, was not cruel. It was simply truthful in the only way he knew how. He spoke of roads still to travel, of work unfinished, of dangers that made attachments unwise. The language of a man who has convinced himself that staying alone is a kindness to others. She nodded. She was young, but not naive. Later that night, when the inn had quieted and Geralt had gone to his room, I found Essie alone with her lute. She was composing something new, not the foam song, not the mermaid's lament, but a simpler melody, almost childish. When she caught me listening, she flushed and laughed it off, blaming the sea air for making her sentimental. I did not tell her then that I understood exactly what she was doing, translating a feeling she could not safely confess into a tune no one would suspect. I did not say that I too had once fallen for a pair of tired witcher eyes, and had, over time, learned to file that affection under friendship to keep it from tearing me open. Some truths, shared too early, feel like burdens. She deserved her own private courage. We parted some days later. Contracts and journeys pulled us in different directions. Essie headed toward inland courts, where tears and longing can still be woven into fashionable entertainment. We rode along the coast a while longer, the surf whispering at our side. I sometimes think of her when I hear certain chords. There are songs I never performed for public ears, fragments she played that evening on the beach, which I remember more clearly than some full ballads of my own. It seems unfair, in a way, that the world applauds the lies we polish for the stage, while the small, honest melodies we write for a single person fade, unheard. And so we are left to wonder whether the truest sacrifices of love are the grand gestures that everyone sees, or the quiet decision to carry an unreturned feeling like a seashell in the pocket, worn smooth over time, never shown, yet always reminding us of the shore where we once stood and listened to someone else's heart learn how to break without making a sound. There are songs I never wrote. People assume that a bard's life is one long harvest, every feeling gathered, threshed, and turned into verses for public consumption. In truth, the best of what we live through often rots quietly in the field. We walk away from it, humming, pretending not to notice the fragrance of something that might have been wine if only we had dared to press it. After we left the sea, and Essie Davin went her own way. I told myself that our paths would cross again. The profession is small. Taverns, oddly numerous as they are, form a sort of scattered home. We will meet at some court, I said. We will remind each other of the foam and the mermaid, and that ridiculous priest who nearly started a crusade over a fishery. We will laugh. We will both be older and therefore safer. I promised myself this with the cheerfulness of a man who has never yet had cause to doubt time's generosity. In the months that followed, her presence lingered in small ways. Geralt and I would be riding through a nameless valley, and I would find myself humming a few bars of her seashelled melody. He would glance over, not quite recognizing the tune, but sensing the mood. "You are maudlin," he would say. "I am a professional," I would reply. "Melancholy is half the trade." I did not tell him that the other half, increasingly, seemed to be restraint, the discipline of not saying, not singing, not asking. We continued as we always did. Contracts, inns, rumours. Once, in a fortified town, I heard that Essie had performed there a fortnight before. The innkeeper spoke of her with the delighted awe reserved for comets and rare wines. She made a room of drunk men cry with a song about a pearl, he said. Imagine that. Rough dock workers wiping their noses on their sleeves like children. One of them tried to pay her in rope, the poor fool, because he had nothing else and could not bear to leave the song unpaid. I pretended to be amused. In truth, a small, stupid jealousy prickled. Not because she had moved them so deeply, but because I had not been there to be ruined with them. To hear that song about a pearl which Geralt, I suspected, was not entirely about a piece of hardened sea treasure. Later, in another town, a merchant proudly recounted that a young bardess had refused his attempt to set her up for life in exchange for exclusive rights to her voice. She said, he reported, still scandalized, that some songs cannot be bought, that they belong to the person who listens, not to the one who pays. That sounded exactly like her. I lifted my cup in an invisible toast to her courage, and then, for reasons I could not immediately name, did not drink. News travels unevenly. Some fates reach you long after they are decided. It was nearly a year later, in a city far from the sea, that I learned of her death. Not from a lover, not from a family member, but from a courtier who relayed it as one might mention the weather in another province. "Terrible thing," he said, vaguely reaching for a pastry. The little bard, with the mark by her eye. Took sick. Pox or something like it. Quite a loss to the winter season. She was a favourite at private gatherings. He moved on to discuss tariffs before the word loss had finished echoing in my chest. I remember the moments that followed with unbearable clarity. The pattern in the table's wood, the way sunlight angled through the hall, lighting dust motes that drifted like slow snow. Someone laughing at the far end of the room, my fingers tightening around my wine cup until they hurt. A sensation like falling sideways through memory. The beach, her hair caught by the wind, the precise care with which she tuned her lute. I left the hall without excuse. In the courtyard, I found a bench and sat, staring at nothing. The sounds of the city wheels on cobblestones, hawkers. Bells came from a great distance, as if muffled by water. I thought of the mermaid, turning into foam so as not to drown the man she loved in scandal. Of Essie, shaping songs out of a feeling she knew would never be returned. Of Geralt, riding away along the beach with the same steady gait he used, leaving monster dens and burning villages. Of myself, watching it all and naming it material. Grief surprised me by its shape. It was not a storm, not at first. It was an absence, a sudden echo where a voice should have been. I realized that I had been storing away little facts, her laugh, her chords, the tilt of her head when she was thinking, as if there would be time later to decide what they meant. Time, that quiet thief, had strolled by and taken the decision from me. That night I tried to write her song. I lit candles, laid fresh parchment on the table, took up my quill. The first lines came easily. They always do. Praise for her voice, a metaphor about sea glass, something clever about her nickname, Little Eye. I filled a verse, crossed it out, filled another. All of them rang false. They were ballads about a legend I had not known, not about the Essie who had stumbled over a word while translating for a mermaid and laughed at herself, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Not about the Essie who had, just once, looked at Geralt as if the entire coastline hung on his next breath. The true song pressed against my throat, refusing to pass through the respectable shapes of rhyme and refrain. Geralt heard the news a few weeks later. We were in a small town where winter had settled early, turning every breath to smoke. I told him in a stable while he checked Roach's hooves, because there is never a good place to share certain sentences. He stopped, one hand on the mare's leg, and closed his eyes for a moment longer than a blink. When he opened them, his face was unchanged, but the air between us had thickened. "She was young," he said. "Yes," I answered. "She wanted." He did not finish. There was a silence then that I did not break with wit. Some things cannot be shielded with jokes without turning them obscene. That night he sat by the fire longer than usual, staring into the flames while they painted restless gold along the scars on his hands. I played quietly, not Essie's melodies, those were too sharp still, but older tunes, neutral ones, the musical equivalent of a friend sitting nearby without speaking. "Write her a song," he said at last. "I tried," I replied. "Try again." His voice held no command, only an odd gentleness, as if he understood that this task needed more than professional skill. It required the courage to let something finally hurt. I did try again. For weeks I wrote fragments, a line here, an image there, her shoe sinking in wet sand, the way she tilted her head when listening too carefully, the small crease between her brows when she realized a dream was impossible and chose, with very deliberate dignity, to keep it anyway. The song that emerged in the end was simple. No grand metaphors, no daring modulations. A few verses about a girl who sang of pearls and foam and walked away from the shore with her heart still beating in the right place, even as it bled. I did not perform it often. When I did, it was usually late, when the remaining patrons were sleepy and the innkeeper tolerant. Most took it for a sweet, sad love song, the kind bards have been writing since before ink dried. They swayed, sighed, and forgot it by morning. But there were a few, always a few, who went still when I reached the last refrain. A sailor staring into his cup, a young woman at the back, wiping her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. Once, a little girl who came up afterward and asked whether the woman in the song had ever been happy. "Yes," I told her, "for a while. Enough to make it worth singing about." I did not tell her that some stories are too delicate to be passed down whole. We cut them into manageable pieces, sand away the inconvenient edges, and leave audiences with something that can be applauded without hurting too much. The unwritten parts linger, like the echo of a last note after the strings have gone mute. Essie Davin did not conquer kingdoms or topple tyrants. She did something quieter and, to me, just as brave. She loved fully, knew it would not be returned as she wished, and still refused to let that love curdle into bitterness. The world, ever busy with crowns and wars, barely noticed. That is why I keep her in the margins of other tales, smuggled into verses about foam and pearls and little eyes that see more than they are given credit for. And so we are left to wonder whether the most enduring stories are the ones engraved in chronicles, or the small, tender narratives we carry inside us, half sung, half silent, about those whose lives brushed ours, just long enough to change the key of our hearts before slipping, like a forgotten melody, back into the vast unrecorded hush from which all songs first rise. The road bends in ways we cannot see while we are walking it. Looking back now, I can trace a crooked line from Essie's damp shoreline to the forest that waited for us later. Deep and patient, its roots tangled with something older than grief. At the time, it felt like just another journey, just another promise of coin in a borderland where maps were already starting to blur under the pressure of armies no one yet named aloud. Rumours travelled faster than banners. There were whispers of Nilfgaardian envoys, of Sintra standing proud and stubborn at the southern edge of the world, of kings counting soldiers instead of harvests. Geralt took note the way he always did when trouble brewed at the level of crowns. He did not seek such storms, yet they had a way of blowing him off his chosen path. I, being softer and more foolish, listened only half-heartedly. Wars are bad for tavern business. I preferred forests, mountains, things with clear edges and decent acoustics. It was just such a forest that appeared ahead of us, rising like a dark wave above the surrounding country. Brokilon. Even the name seemed to grow moss as you spoke it. Peasants muttered that the trees moved at night. Coaches avoided its borders. Minstrels spoke of dryads with their bows and their unwavering refusal to tolerate the tramp of human boots. It was the sort of place storytellers love from a safe distance. We had reason to approach it because trouble, as usual, had taken advantage of fear. Merchants were disappearing near the forest's edge. Lords grumbled about bandits who vanished into the green shadows. No one wished to enter Brokilon to investigate. So instead, they hired a man who makes a profession of stepping into places others respectfully avoid. Geralt asked a few questions, listened to the villagers repeat the same rumours, and set his course along the tree line. I followed with less enthusiasm. The forest felt wrong even before we crossed into its shade. Birds fell silent as we drew near, replaced by a stillness that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of listening. The first step beneath its branches was like entering a different world. Light filtered down in narrow shafts, turning dust and pollen into drifting gold. The air smelled of sap, damp earth, and something sharp that made my skin prickle. Every trunk seemed older than the kingdoms on my map. Roots knotted the ground into a maze that forced us to slow. I tried to talk, to scatter my unease with jokes, but the words died quickly. It is difficult to be witty under the steady regard of trees that were alive before your ancestors learned to hold a plough. Geralt moved with quiet care, as if he too sensed that every misplaced footprint would be noted. The arrow that thudded into the earth near my boot was perfectly placed, close enough to make a point, far enough not to nick a single hair. I froze. Geralt had already raised his hand away from his sword, fingers spread in a gesture that said, as clearly as any speech, that he understood whose territory this was. They appeared without theatrics. One moment the glade was empty. The next, it contained dryads, stepping out from behind trunks where a heartbeat before there had been no one. Their skin held the colour of leaves and bark. Their eyes were distant, as if some part of them remained always turned inward, listening to the forest's slow pulse. Bows were drawn, but not fully tensed. They were past the stage of warning, and not yet at the stage of execution. Geralt spoke, not in trade talk, but in the old tongue, each word deliberate. He asked permission to pass. They answered with the sort of chilly disinterest one reserves for a traveller who has already parked his horse on the temple steps. Humans had cut too many trees, spilled too much sap for their patience to be generous. I, who am accustomed to charming difficult audiences, attempted a bow and a smile. It earned me a length of rope around the wrists and the privilege of walking at the centre of their formation. Geralt received the same courtesy. Witcher or not, he was still human, and Brokilon did not distinguish. We were led deeper under the canopy, farther from the reassuring strip of sky. It was during that march that I first sensed it. Not a sound, not a sight, but a feeling at the edge of awareness, like a melody played just beyond hearing. The forest was aware of us, not as individuals, but as representatives of something it distrusted. Our presence weighed on it as surely as its branches weighed on the air. We reached a clearing that felt absurdly like the interior of a cathedral. Shafts of light fell on a pool so clear it seemed solid, on a stone where moss had arranged itself into a natural altar. Around it stood more dryads, some grown, some still slender with youth. Among them, dishevelled and angry in the way only a frightened child can be, stood a girl. At first glance she was unremarkable, thin with tangled ashen hair, clothes torn by brambles and travel. Her chin was lifted at a defiant angle that offered more courage than she possessed, yet her eyes were bright, fevered not with sickness, but with a fierce, searching intelligence. She glared at us as if we were an insult personally dropped into her day. "Another one," she said to the nearest dryad. Another clanking oaf to be fed leaves and told to go away. Her words were sharp, but underneath them I heard something more fragile, the exhausted bravado of someone who has lost the right to choose where she stands. Geralt looked at her for a long moment, longer than one would observe any stranger in such a place. Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly. I thought at first it was simple pity. Then I saw that his stillness was not softness, but recognition, as if he had seen her once already in a dream, and was now startled to find her rendered in flesh. The dryads treated her not quite as a prisoner, not quite as a guest. She had drunk their waters, they said. The forest claimed those who drank deeply. It was their way of preserving themselves against a world that pressed closer every year with axes and fire. They would offer her a life among them, a place in the quiet, eternal green. The alternative, outside their borders, was noise, iron, and the reach of men who traded children as easily as grain. The girl listened, fists clenched. She did not want to be traded. She did not trust humans. Yet she watched Geralt with a curiosity that broke through her anger again and again, like a sprout pushing through stubborn soil. In murmured exchanges, in fragments of explanation offered by both sides, another shape began to emerge. A promise once made by Geralt in a distant hall, tied to a law as old as the sagas, concerning a child destined to be his by a twist of chance. A shipwreck, a princess, a kingdom named Sintra, a web of coincidences so dense that any gambler would have knelt before it in awe. Geralt, stubborn as always when confronted with prophecy, tried to step away from it. He argued that the girl's life should not be bound by any law of surprise, that she deserved to choose her path, whether among the dryads or back in the perilous world of men. I watched him, recognizing the fear beneath his reasoning. Destiny to him was a chain masquerading as fate. He had spent too long cherishing his few remaining freedoms to surrender them lightly, even to a child who might heal something in him he did not dare admit was broken. The girl, however, did not reason like a philosopher. She looked at him and saw, I think, something simpler and more terrifying, a shape that fit into the empty place inside her where the idea of a guardian should have been. Her parents were stories and ashes. Her future was a list of other people's plans. Geralt was the first solid thing that did not immediately try to own her. When they spoke alone near the pool, I kept my distance out of courtesy. Still, sound carries strangely in such places. I heard her voice rise and fall, saw her small hand move in the air, she argued. More importantly, I saw the way she stepped a fraction closer to him each time, as if pulled by a force she could not name. By the time the sun had dipped to a late afternoon angle, the matter was no longer a question of abstract laws. It was as simple as this: stay in the forest and become someone else entirely, or walk out beside this white-haired stranger and face a world that had already nearly swallowed her twice. She chose him. Geralt tried to refuse the weight of that choice. The dryads watched with an expression I had seen once before on very old trees that have outlasted many storms. They knew better than any of us that some decisions are not really made in the moment. The girl's path had been curving toward this meeting long before she knew his name. We left Brokilon with the forest at our backs and the child at our side. She walked between us, sturdy despite her thinness, eyes darting from shadow to shadow with the wary attention of someone for whom danger had always been a companion. From time to time she would glance up at Geralt, as if making sure he remained solid, that he did not vanish like so many adults in her life had done. I watched them both, feeling a strange mixture of relief and displacement. Something important had happened in that clearing, and I, for once, was not at its center. I was a witness, a minor note in a melody already begun without me. The air outside the forest tasted different, lighter perhaps, but also emptier. Behind us, Brokilon resumed its whispering, the leaves knitting the opening we had used. Ahead lay roads, wars, destinies no longer content to lurk at the edges of our tasks. And so we are left to wonder whether destiny truly descends upon us like a thunderbolt, or whether it waits instead in deep, ancient places, patiently arranging paths until one day a tired witcher and a stubborn child step into the same pool of light, and find, to their shared astonishment, that they have been walking toward one another for far longer than either of them can remember. Children accept miracles more easily than adults. That is their blessing and their curse. When we left Brokilon, I treated the whole affair as an extraordinary incident, a story to be polished and fitted between others. Geralt treated it as a complication his life did not need. The girl treated it as the most obvious thing in the world. Of the three of us, she was the only one behaving sensibly. At first, our journey from the forest's edge felt provisional. Geralt walked as if he were escorting a lost lamb to the nearest shepherd. The girl, Ciri, though she accrued nicknames quickly, strode at his side with the determined steps of someone who has decided that whichever path his boots take is now, by definition, also hers. "You will take me where I must go," she said, on the first evening by the fire. It was not a plea. It was a statement of natural law, uttered in the tone one uses to note that rain falls downward and wolves howl at night. Geralt frowned. Witches dislike being told what they must do, particularly by people half their size and a tenth their age. He mumbled something about returning her to relatives, guardians, proper people. She listened with a politeness far beyond her years, then repeated more quietly, "You will take me where I must go." The forest had given her back, but not empty-handed. She carried with her the bruises of capture, the ghost of fear, in the way she flinched at sudden noises. Yet beneath that lay a core of iron. I have met kings less certain of their own existence. As we walked, fragments of her story emerged. Cintra, a grandmother who wore her authority like armour, a mother and father lost long ago in a storm that had swallowed ship and certainty alike. Promises made in great halls over the noise of feasting. The words, child of surprise, spoken as if they were both curse and talisman. Geralt listened, expression unreadable. I recognized some of those names, some of those knights. I had been in that hall when Calanthe, Lioness of Cintra, tested a witcher's honour with a dangerous jest. I had heard him invoke the law of surprise with the sort of careless bravery men adopt when they assume that fate is too tired to pay attention to them. Now, years later, fate walked beside him in muddy boots, scowling at midges and tugging at Roach's mane when she thought he was not looking. One afternoon, as we skirted a village whose people eyed us with the wary hostility reserved for outsiders and witches in particular, Ciri fell into step beside me. "Is he always like this?" she asked, jerking her chin toward Geralt's back. "Like what?" I said. "Like the road is the only thing that matters. Like people are stones he trips over." It was a perceptive observation for someone whose head barely reached my shoulder. "He is like someone who has walked alone for a long time," I answered. When you are used to expecting hurt, you begin to see even kindness as a stone you might break your toe on. She wrinkled her nose at this. "That is stupid," she declared. "Yes," I said, "but some kinds of stupidity are difficult to cure." She considered that in silence, then added, almost to herself, "He is mine." The possessive was not coy. It was fierce, protective. I had heard similar tones from wolf mothers. That night, by the fire, she fell asleep with her head near his elbow. He did not move her away. Witches are trained to sleep lightly, ready for trouble. Yet, as the flames died down and the shadows thickened, I saw something soften in his posture, a fraction's relaxation, as if some small sentry inside him had finally been granted leave to rest. In the next town, he tried to leave her. It was, from one point of view, a reasonable plan. He made inquiries, found a respectable householder merchant's family with no surviving children, a decent reputation, and a desire for an heir. They saw at once that Ciri was not ordinary. They saw, too, that she came with no dowry and a complicated past. The combination proved irresistible to their peculiar brand of piety. "We will do our Christian duty," they said, already rehearsing how they would phrase it to their neighbours. Ciri listened to their offers with polite boredom. When they suggested she might like pretty dresses and embroidery, her expression froze. When they mentioned that she would, of course, be expected to forget any unsuitable acquaintances from her former life, she did not bother to answer. Geralt explained the arrangement to her that evening in the inn. He spoke gently. Safe, he said. Proper schooling. A bed that was always in the same place. No monsters, no wars. She sat on the stool opposite him, hands folded, face unnaturally calm. "I understand," she said. The next morning, before dawn, she was already on Roach, blanket bundled behind the saddle, hair wild around her face. Geralt stopped halfway through tightening the girth. "Where," he asked, "do you think you are going?" "With you," she replied. Obviously. He tried reason. He tried sternness. He even tried silence, his favourite tactic. She endured them all, eyes bright, jaw clenched. "You promised," she said at last. "I promised nothing," he answered. Then he did. She lifted her chin toward the east, where somewhere beyond our sight lay Sintra's towers and a graveyard of broken vows. "He claimed you by surprise. He did not ask me. I am asking. A child arguing using the language of destiny would have been laughable if it had not been so entirely serious." I watched Geralt, wondering if he heard the same echo I did. The inevitable closing of a circle he had tried to pretend was a straight line. "You owe me nothing," he said finally. She shook her head. "That is not how owing works," she replied. "You owe the promise. I am only the piece that makes it real." It was an extraordinary phrase. I suspect she did not fully understand what she had said. Yet, in that moment, something in Geralt's face gave way. Not a great collapse, no dramatic surrender, just a small loosening, like the first crack in ice at the start of thaw. He told her she could stay until the next town. Children of her sort know that until is just another way of saying from now on. She accepted his fake compromise with a solemn nod. We rode on, now undeniably 3. I would like to say that everything changed overnight, that Geralt became a father in his own eyes, that Ciri instantly felt safe, that the road reshaped itself into a path for a new family. Reality prefers incremental shifts. Geralt still woke at every sound. He still looked again and again for a place to set her down. Ciri still had nightmares that made her kick and gasp. There were tantrums over food, over danger, over my singing. There were days when they barely spoke, and others when they would fall into conversation so animated that I might as well have been a hedge by the roadside. Something else altered, however, something subtle but decisive. When trouble appeared, a contract gone wrong, a village unfriendly, a narrow pass requiring quick decisions, Geralt no longer calculated only his own odds. I watched him measure distances, threats, exits, always with a glance at where Ciri stood or rode. Fear for himself had rarely touched him. Fear for someone else crept into his movements like the first chill of autumn in the air. He did not like it. "Caring makes you slow," he muttered once when he thought I was asleep. "Caring makes you sloppy. Caring makes you alive," I said from my blanket. He grunted. Agreement, perhaps? Ciri, for her part, adjusted to our peculiar little procession with disconcerting speed. She learned to pack quickly, to sleep in her clothes, to read weather in the tension of Geralt's shoulders. She argued with him over the proper seasoning of stew, over which roads were boring, over whether I should be allowed to finish certain bawdy verses within her hearing. She began to sparkle again, here and there, like glass polished by waves after being hurled against stones. Yet she never relinquished that first fierce claim. "He is my destiny," I overheard her murmur once, not to us, but to the night, while we camped beneath a sky pricked with indifferent stars. I wonder now whether she understood how radical that declaration was. For years, destiny had been something done to her, by storms, by queens, by laws older than ink. To say, "he is my destiny," was to turn the phrase inside out, to make choice out of what others had called compulsion. Geralt continued to insist that he did not believe in fate. He believed in contracts, steel, and the stubbornness of his own will. But as I watched them walk ahead of me on those dusty roads, sheer step matching his, smaller but determined, I began to suspect that belief is not a prerequisite for being claimed. Some patterns simply insist on themselves, no matter how we name them. And so we are left to wonder whether the bonds that change us most are the ones we choose with clear, adult understanding, or the ones that arrive in the shape of a thin, ashen-haired child who looks at us with fierce certainty and says, to our great discomfort and eventual salvation, "You are mine," long before we learn how to say, with equal courage, "And you are mine as well." There is a kind of silence that comes before war, not the clean, echoing hush of a church, nor the heavy quiet of a forest waiting for dawn. This silence is made of unfinished sentences, of glasses set down a little too carefully, of music that falters on a note and does not quite find its way back. I have played through such silences in more taverns than I care to count. It did not descend all at once. At first, it was only a change in the questions people asked between verses. Once, the pauses in my songs were filled with requests for filthy stories and complaints about wives, husbands, and taxes. Then, gradually, the talk shifted. "Have you heard?" someone would ask. "About Nilfgaard?" Always like that. Not an empire, just a rumour with a directional suffix. Somewhere down there, beyond proper maps, beyond the polite borders of the north, something was stirring. Traders brought back stories of discipline and black armour, of roads laid straight across swamps, of coins stamped with an unfamiliar sun. At first, no one believed it mattered. Distant powers have always risen and fallen. What is one more imperial appetite when you are worried about next winter's grain? Yet the questions kept coming. Had we heard about a new commander? About armies drilling all year instead of disbanding after harvest? about treaties offered with one hand and sharpened with the other? I sang, nodded, drank, and watched. Geralt said little. Witches are not strategists. They are practical men, paid to kill practical problems. Still, he listened when border guards grumbled about patrols being doubled, when refugees passed through towns that had never before been on any sort of route, when merchants muttered about tariffs changing in ways that suggested someone, somewhere, was already drawing new lines on a future map. Ciri had left us by then. That is a sentence I have been avoiding, even now. It suggests a clean departure, a moment when bags were packed and farewells exchanged. The truth was muddier. After Brokilon, there were days together, then days apart, a rhythm of meeting and parting dictated by circumstances, and Geralt's stubborn conviction that she would always be safer somewhere else. Each time he handed her into someone's care friends, allies. Well-guarded households, I saw the same flicker in his eyes, a mixture of relief and something very like pain. She needs stability, he would say. She needs you, I would reply. He would grunt, the way he did when a blade did not quite strike true. We are such cowards, we adults, when confronted with the fierce loyalty of children. They offer themselves so completely that we flinch, fearing we will fail them, and in trying not to wound them, we end up abandoning them instead. Meanwhile, the world kept tightening. Cintra, that proud southern lioness, became a name men spoke with a little more weight. Calanthe's feasts grew more restrained, they said, even as her titles lengthened. There were reports of embassies received with frosty ceremony and sent away with smiles that did not touch the eyes. Armies were counted. Lines were drawn on parchment and then erased when someone realized they overlapped with older, more fragile agreements. In taverns near borders, I noticed that jokes about Nilfgaard landed differently. Once, a well-timed quip about black armor had earned me laughter and a free drink. Later, the same joke drew uneasy shifts and a glance toward the door, as if someone might be listening. Fear changes not only what we say, but how loudly we permit ourselves to say it. We played for soldiers more often. Garrison commanders paid well for entertainment. Idle troops make poor decisions in the dark. I watched young men and women dance, their boots clumsy on barracks floors, their laughter too loud. They did not speak of death. They spoke of uniforms, of promotions, of the chance to prove themselves. War, to those who have not yet seen it, is always an exam they are sure they will pass. Occasionally, a veteran would sit in the corner and watch them with the expression of a man observing children playing at being adults. When I sang certain older ballad songs that did not glamorize battles but described them as mud, blood, and confusion, I would see those veterans close their eyes, not to savor the song, but to block it. Memory, it seems, can hurt more than ignorance. News from Cintra came in fragments. A skirmish on the border. A disagreement over some obscure succession clause. A delegation from Nilfgaard turned away with polite insults. Calanthe, it was said, had never learned the art of bowing in any direction but her own choosing. Somewhere in those halls, Ciri should have been safe, surrounded by stone, banners, and people who at least belonged to her by blood. That is what Geralt told himself. It is what I told him, and myself, on nights when the fire burned low and we both stared into it, as if it might show us the future. Queens Guard their grandchildren fiercely, I said. Calanthe will not let harm touch her. He nodded, but the gesture lacked conviction. On the road, we encountered more refugees, not the usual trickle of vagrants and wanderers, but families whose clothes had once been fine and were now torn, whose children still carried toys from better days. They spoke of villages burned by mistake during border maneuvers, of fields trampled under hooves, of taxes raised to pay for someone else's armor. A farmer in one such group, his hands raw from gripping the reins of a cart he no longer owned, said something that has stayed with me. "It is not war yet," he muttered in the inn yard. They say that. Not war, just incidents, just preparations, just exercises. Strange, how many people can die from things that are not war yet? Geralt and I shared a glance. Neither of us had an answer. In the cities, the mood grew stranger. Markets were still busy, theatres still open, but there was a nervous energy beneath the bustle. Men in fine clothes suddenly took great interest in maps. Women who once discussed fashions now compared the relative safety of different cousins' estates. Priests found new enthusiasm for sermons about sacrifice and destiny. It is always easier to ask others to die when you can tell them a story about higher purpose. I did what I have always done. I sang for whomever paid me. Kings, knights, merchants, soldiers. Some nights I celebrated their bravery. Other nights I slipped in verses about widows and orphans, about cities weighed down by their own ashes. Most audiences preferred the former. A few listened to the latter with tight jaws and eyes that did not quite meet mine when I bowed. There were rumours of a battle near a place called Sodden. Sorcerers on both sides, they said. A hill that burned for 3 days. Names of mages recited like a litany, some marked as heroes, others as missing, still others as traitors, depending on who was speaking. The North claimed victory. The South adjusted its plans. Common folk learned to pronounce names of places they would never see and attach their fear to them like a coat of arms. It was around this time that I realized how much of human life is spent pretending that catastrophe is still negotiable. We speak of tensions, of diplomatic options, of limited engagements, as if war were a stubborn dinner guest who might yet be convinced to leave early if we choose our words correctly. Meanwhile, carts roll past carrying the displaced, and graveyards quietly expand their boundaries. I thought often of Ciri. In my mind, she was always slightly younger than she had become, caught in that moment in Brokilon when she stood between dryads and witcher, demanding a choice. I imagined her in Sintra's halls, listening to adults speak in careful euphemisms, learning to read the fear behind their brave faces. Children sense the truth long before we think to tell them. We cannot hide the tremor in our hands when we pour their milk. Geralt spoke less of her as time went on, which was how I knew he thought of her more. He would pause at crossroads leading south, gaze down the road, then turn away. Destiny, he insisted, was not a leash. The law of surprise, he said, did not make him a guardian. He had delivered the child to her rightful place. He had done what he could. A witcher cannot stand against armies. These arguments were not for my benefit. He was addressing a jury inside himself. I might have pushed harder. I might have urged him toward Sintra, toward the lioness queen and the girl who had once declared him hers. Instead, I did what bards so often do in the face of approaching storms. I sought better-paying engagements and told myself that staying near courts would give me access to information, to songs, to safety. "Things will resolve themselves," I said one night, more to comfort my conscience than to inform Geralt. "They usually do." He glanced at me, eyes tired. "Yes," he said, "one way or another." And so we are left to wonder whether it is ignorance that blinds us to gathering storms, or a quieter, more willful kind of blindness, a refusal to look too closely at the patterns we already see forming. Because deep down we suspect that if we recognized them honestly, we would be forced to admit that the time for harmless songs and careful neutrality is ending, and that we, too, must decide where and with whom we will stand when the silence finally breaks. Some friendships are built on shared victories. Ours, it turned out, was built on a bed that stank of herbs and iron, in a cottage where the roof leaked and the world outside had just finished tearing itself apart. I will not linger on the battle that put Geralt there. Others have told that part with more relish than I can stomach. Suffice it to say that roads had filled with refugees, banners had marched where no banners should be, and at some nameless crossing of fields and ditches a column of soldiers met a stream of fugitives. A witcher, travelling the wrong road at the wrong time, stepped in to keep swords from striking where they should never have been raised. There was shouting, confusion, the dull thud of bodies striking ground. I arrived late, as bards often do when the worst has already happened. I saw enough: the black and gold of Nilfgaardian armour, the torn remnants of northern colours, a wagon overturned and its cargo of lives spilled across the mud, and Geralt lying unnaturally still, cloak darkened where spear and steel had found their way in between ribs and destiny. Someone else had pulled him clear, a merchant with kind eyes and shaking hands, more brave than he would ever admit. He had no idea whom he had saved, only that a man who had just fought to shield strangers from slaughter did not deserve to be left as carrion. We travelled together after that, myself, the merchant, his anxious wife, their fearful child, and Geralt stretched on a plank laid across the wagon's bed, jolted with every rut. He drifted in and out, skin hot, breath shallow. Witches are hard to kill, but they are not invulnerable. Whatever alchemy had reshaped his body could not banish infection or erase the simple arithmetic of blood lost. I did what I could, which turned out to be very little. I held cups to cracked lips. I changed bandages under the merchant's wife's sharp, competent directions. I muttered jokes to a man who could not hear them, because silence frightened me more than his ragged breathing. At night, when we stopped by hedges or in abandoned farmyards, I watched over him while others slept. I had sung about wounded heroes since I was old enough to hold a lute. Those verses had always ended with miraculous recoveries just in time for the final duel. Now, sitting in the flicker of a small, stubborn fire, I saw how long the middle part truly lasted. The hours when nothing happened except shivering, muttering, the small, fierce labour of a body trying not to let go. He talked in his fever, not clearly. Names, fragments, half-formed pleas. I heard Calanthe more than once. That lioness queen whose pride had been no match for an empire's patience. I heard Pavetta and Donny, the couple whose banquet had once upended itself into chaos and surprise. I heard Ciri, like a refrain, repeated in tones that shifted from command to apology to something almost like prayer. Sometimes he spoke my name, too, not as a call for help, just as one might recite a familiar word when wandering through fog. I am here, I would say, every time. Try not to make me improvise your funeral march. I have nothing appropriate in the right key. It was a poor joke. He did not laugh. I made it anyway, because my hands needed something to do besides tremble. The merchant, his name was Jurga, watched all this with a kind of awed distress. He saved my life, he told me on the second night, as we sat a little apart from the wagon. His son slept in his lap, clutching a carved wooden horse. I would have died there, with my family. I cannot repay that. I shrugged, because the magnitude of such debt frightened me. Try, I said finally. Feed him. Let him lie still. Do what you can. Fate is very bad at mathematics. It prefers stories to settled accounts. He nodded, perhaps not understanding, but comforted by the sound of an answer. There were moments when I nearly broke. Once, when we had been turned away from yet another inno room, they said, though I saw empty pallets inside, I walked behind the wagon cursing under my breath. Cursing kings who had started conflicts they would not personally bleed in. Cursing soldiers who obeyed. Cursing Geralt for stepping in. Cursing myself for not having pulled him away sooner. It is easy to assign blame when you are helpless. It makes the world feel less arbitrary. That night, exhausted, I dozed on my stool by his side. When I woke, the fire was down to embers. Around us, the dark pressed close. Geralt was muttering again, eyes flickering beneath his lids. His hand groped vaguely at his chest, searching for something. I caught it. His skin burned. His fingers tightened around mine with shockingly little strength. "Dandelion," he whispered. "I know," I said. "Terrible as always. Try not to die while holding my hand. I would never live it down." He did not smile, but his breathing eased slightly. For a few heartbeats, he seemed almost present, as if some narrow window had opened between delirium and waking. "She is gone," he said. I thought he meant Essie, or perhaps someone from the battle. "Who?" I asked softly. "Sintra," he murmured. "Ciri, lost." The words fell like stones into my chest. I had heard stories already, in scraps. The siege, the flames, the slaughter. Calanthe on the walls, defiant until the end. Reports said that no one had found the princess's body. Reports are strange things. They give hope and despair in equal measure. "She is not here," I said, because that much was true. "But that does not mean she is lost." He frowned, the faintest crease between his brows, as if some part of him were arguing with itself even in sleep. "Too late," he breathed. Then the window closed. He slipped back into the depths, leaving me holding his hand long after his grip had slackened. I realized then how utterly powerless I was. A witcher can fight with steel. A sorceress can twist reality. A queen can command armies. And I, Dandelion, armed with cords and cleverness, could only sit beside a broken man and offer the thin shield of my presence. It should have felt pathetic. Instead, To my surprise, it felt like something almost worthy. The days blurred. The road changed from churned mud to patchy grass to the first hints of spring. We stopped once at a wayside chapel, where a priest muttered generic blessings over Geralt's unmoving form and tried to charge Jurga for the privilege. The merchant, to his credit, refused. Charity that demands coin in advance is merely commerce dressed up for temple. Bit by bit, the colour returned to Geralt's face. The fever broke one dawn with a shudder that left him soaking and skeletal, but breathing more evenly. His wounds no longer seeped. He slept then, not the agitated snatching of fever dreams, but the deep, dreamless exhaustion of someone whom the world has beaten within a finger's breadth of the grave, and then inexplicably spared. When he finally woke properly, days later, it was midday. Sunlight lanced through the wagon slit, hitting his eyes. He blinked, squinted, and looked around with the baffled suspicion of a man who does not entirely believe in survival. "Still with us," I said, moving into his field of vision. How disappointing for the undertaker I had already begun composing a beautiful lament for. He frowned. "Dandelion," he said, as if the name tasted strange. "Where?" "Between nowhere and somewhere," I answered. "On a road that leads to a merchant's farm, and possibly to a new debt you will loathe acknowledging." Jurga, summoned, hurried over, babbling thanks and plans. He spoke of offering Geralt sanctuary, of sharing his home, of honouring a promise he himself had made under duress when the Witcher had saved him. Once again, the law of surprise raised its head, that old capricious device that had already bound Geralt's life to more threads than he cared to count. I watched Geralt's face as Jurga spoke. Weariness warred with wariness, yet beneath both I glimpsed something new, a quiet, bewildered gratitude that anyone at all had carried him when he could not stand. "You stayed," he said to me later, when we were briefly alone. "Of course I stayed," I replied airily. "Who else would make sure you did not die in some humorless stranger's cart?" He regarded me for a moment. "You could have left," he insisted. "There was nothing you could do." "On the contrary," I said, "I could do exactly what I did. Shout at you to breathe and hold your hand when you listened. Not everyone needs a sword to be useful." The words sounded braver than I felt. He must have seen something of the truth behind them, because his expression softened. "Thank you," he said simply. "No grand speeches, no vows, just those two words, offered with a sincerity so rare in his mouth that for a heartbeat I could not answer." "You are welcome," I managed. "Try not to make a habit of it. My nerves will not survive you nearly dying every time the continent decides to redraw itself." He made a sound that might, in another man, have been a laugh. In that cramped wagon, between a kind merchant's family and the ruin of recent battles, something shifted between us. I had always admired Geralt, envied him, been exasperated by him. I had written him into dozens of songs, some accurate, most embellished. But until then, I had never fully understood what it meant to belong, however messily, to another person's survival. And so we are left to wonder whether the greatest acts of friendship are the ones that change the course of battles, or the quieter, less poetic ones, sitting awake while someone shivers on a plank, answering when they call your name through fever, and choosing again and again to stay within arm's reach of their pain, even when there is nothing practical you can do except bear witness and refuse, stubbornly, to leave. If death is a door, then Geralt spent a long, uncomfortable time with his hand on the latch, listening to voices on both sides argue about whether he should come through. By the time Jurga's wagon turned off the main road toward his farm, the worst of the fever had passed. The wounds had closed enough to cease their constant seeping, leaving scars that glowed angry and new across his ribs. He could sit up against the wagon boards for an hour or two without fainting. He could drink broth without choking. In any other man, that would have counted as a miracle. In a witcher, it was merely a slow, irritating recovery. The body mends at its own pace. The mind, however, lingers. Even after the fever broke, the dreams continued. Not the wild, senseless jumble of sickness, but something slower, more deliberate. He would wake in the middle of the night, staring at the wagon's canvas, as if it were a curtain he had just fallen through. "Who were you arguing with?" I asked once. When he startled awake with his jaw clenched and his hand reaching for a sword that was not there. "Everyone," he said. Later, much later, he told me a little of what he had seen in those half-lit intervals between this world and whatever lies behind it. I had already guessed some of it. A bard learns to read the names people mutter in their sleep. There was Nenneke, the priestess of Melitele, scolding him in that crisp, merciless tone of hers, reminding him that a witcher's neutrality is a luxury, not a virtue, when the innocent are trampled. There was Calanthe, blood on her dress and defiance in her eyes, standing on walls that had already fallen in everything but stone. There was Pavetta, hair whipping in a wind no one else could feel, her gaze full of a knowledge that comes only to those who have seen their own deaths approaching and chosen, with terrible clarity, how to meet them. Yennefer was there too, of course. He did not describe her at length. He only said that in those dreams she never came close enough to touch. She stood just beyond his reach, lips moving around words he could not quite hear, as if the distance between them that had always existed in life had followed him faithfully into the corridors of near death, and woven through all of it, like a refrain in a ballad that refuses to let you forget its melody, was Ciri. Not as a child in boots and travel-stained clothes, but as an idea, the lion cub, the promised surprise, the question no prophecy ever phrases clearly. In his dreams she ran ahead of him through ruined halls and burning fields, always just out of sight, laughter turning to echo, echo turning to silence. He woke shaken from those visions, sweat on his forehead despite the lingering chill in his bones. "You keep going after her," I said one morning, when he described haltingly, reluctantly chasing that small, vanishing figure through places that no longer existed. "I never reach her," he replied. "Perhaps that is the point," I suggested. "Perhaps she is not somewhere to be reached, but something to be remembered. The thread that refuses to snap." He grimaced at this, as he always did when I drifted towards a metaphor. Yet he did not dismiss it entirely. The closer we came to Jurga's farm, the clearer the outside world became. Fields appeared, badly tended after months of fear. Hedges that should have been clipped stood ragged. At crossroads, homemade shrines had been erected. Small, desperate altars of ribbons, candles and crude carvings, each a plea flung upward toward any power that might be listening. Jurga tried to fill the silences with talk. He spoke of his wife, Xena, in tones that combined love with a sort of nervous awe, of his modest prosperity built on honest trade and cautious risk, of his terror when Nilfgaard's black cloaks had marched near his roots, and of his vow half-prayer, half-bargain that if he survived to see his family again, he would offer the man who saved him whatever the law of surprise demanded. When he said this last part, I shot Geralt a look. So did the witch's fate, apparently, because it snorted and stretched like a cat in a patch of sunlight, very pleased with itself. You never learn, I muttered. He scowled. It was his choice, he said. I did not ask for it. No, I agreed. You never ask. You simply stand in the one spot on the continent where destiny happens to be passing and then act surprised when it trips over you. He did not dignify that with an answer, which I took as tacit admission of accuracy. We began to hear more detailed news as we passed through villages that still had enough money to host a peddler or two. Sintra was spoken of in the past tense. Its fall had already sprouted legends. Some said Calanthe had leapt from her tower rather than be taken. Others that she had died sword in hand in the palace courtyard. None of them agreed on Ciri. She is dead, one farmer insisted, wiping his hands on his trousers. They never found the body, but that is exactly how these things go. Better to assume the worst than build hope on smoke. She escaped, said an old woman at the same table, eyes flashing. The lion cub does not die in a fire lit by cowards. She slipped through their fingers. You will see. One day she will return and make them choke on their own banners. A drunken mercenary, overhearing, claimed she had been taken south as a prize. Another, more sober, said nothing at all, staring into his drink as if he could see a child's face there and did not care to share what he saw. Geralt listened to all this with an expression so carefully neutral it might as well have been carved. Only once, when a storyteller in a crowded common room embellished Sintra's fall with lurid detail, did I see his jaw tighten. You could correct him, I said later, as we walked back to the wagon. He would not thank me for it, Geralt answered. No one thanks you for taking away the endings they have already made peace with. Still, I noticed that he lingered on mentions of no body found, and rumours of escape a fraction of a heartbeat longer than he did on tales of her certain death. Hope is a stubborn weed. It grows even in the cracks of a witch's armour. By the time Jurga's farm finally came into view, nestled between fields that had somehow escaped the main currents of war, we were all thinner than when we had set out, in body, in patience, in illusions. The house was small but solid, its whitewashed walls catching the late afternoon light. A plume of smoke rose from the chimney with an air of apology, as if wary of drawing the attention of passing armies. Xena stood in the doorway when the wagon rolled into the yard, apron dusted with flour, hair hastily pinned. At the sight of her husband, she ran forward, laughter and tears colliding in her throat. Their child, little, round-faced, astonishingly untouched by the horrors we had passed, clung to her skirt, eyes wide at the sight of the strange men and the battered giant on the cart. There is a particular ache that comes from stepping into peace when you are still dirty with war. The yard smelled of hay and bread. Chickens fussed. Somewhere a dog barked joyfully. It felt indecent almost to carry Geralt's scars into such a place. They helped him inside. settled him on a bed that seemed far too clean for bloody bandages. Jurga bowed and stammered his thanks again, promising to honour his vow properly once Geralt had rested. The law of surprise hung in the air between them like a story half told. "You owe me nothing," Geralt said quietly. "On the contrary," Jurga replied, surprising me with the firmness in his voice. "I owe you more than I can name. Let the law decide the form. It has always been better at inventing fitting gifts than we are." Later, as shadows lengthened across the yard, I stepped outside to breathe air that did not reek of herbs and stale sweat. The merchant's son was chasing a chicken in delighted circles. Near the well, Xena was bent over some task, speaking softly to someone I could not see behind a stack of wood. A moment later, a child stepped into view. Thin, travel-worn, hair ashen and tangled, clothes too big and too small in all the wrong places, as if assembled from whatever could be found in a hurry. She moved with the wary grace of someone accustomed to flight. She turned her head, and for a heartbeat, the yard, the house, the war, all of it vanished. There were only those eyes, wide and greenish, looking out from a face I knew and did not know. I did not call out. My throat closed. I watched as the merchant's wife laid a hand on the girl's shoulder, as the girl shrugged it off with a flash of pride that struck me like a remembered chord. Inside the house, Geralt shifted on the bed, some inner sense already drawing him toward the moment he had spent so long trying not to believe in. And so we are left to wonder whether it is the dead who shape us, more those who visit in dreams with their unchangeable stories, or the living, who return when all the songs and prophecies have already declared their part finished, and by simply standing there, breathing, force us to admit that something more was waiting for us all along, just beyond the edge of what we dared to imagine. Some endings crash like storm surf. This one came in on quiet feet. I was still in Jurga's yard, hand on the doorframe, when the girl stepped out from behind the woodpile. Thin, dusty, sleeves badly mended in 3 different colours of thread. She could have been any child spat out by the war until she lifted her head and spoke the one name that seemed to anchor her to the world. Geralt. The cottage creaked. A chair scraped. He needed only a few steps to reach the doorway, but in the breath between her calling and his appearing, something under everything seemed to shift and settle. Like a stone finally dropping into the hollow it had been carved for long ago. He looked older in that square of light and shadow. The fever was gone, the wounds closed, but the easy belief that nothing could truly reach him had not come back. There were new lines at his eyes, a new weight at his mouth. For a heartbeat they only stared. The witcher who had spent half his life swearing he did not believe in destiny, and the child who had followed the thin thread of his promise through fire and snow. She moved first. Ciri crossed the yard in a handful of quick, uncompromising strides, the way she had once pushed through Brokilon's undergrowth, treating roots and branches as badly placed furniture. All the brittle composure of a hunted orphan fell from her in that movement. She became again the girl in the forest who had looked up and said, as if commenting on the weather, "You are mine." He took one step toward her. That was all. Yet I heard it inside myself, like the quiet click of a lock finally closing. No kneeling, no speeches. She flung her arms around him and held on, fiercely. He folded her in with a care that hurt to watch, as if afraid that if he gripped any tighter she would shatter, and if he held any looser she might vanish. The hands that had drawn steel against nightmares trembled against her tangled hair. "I found you," she said into his chest. "I found you," he answered. They were both right. I looked away, not from embarrassment, but from reverence. Jurga's wife wiped her eyes on her apron. Jurga stood as if watching his wild promise to destiny write itself across his own yard. Their little boy stared, clutching his wooden horse, memorizing something he did not yet have words for. Later, when shock had ebbed to a softer astonishment, we sat around Jurga's table. Bread, stew, cheap beer that tasted like a feast after so many hurried meals by the road. Ciri told her story in spare, practical sentences. The last night in Sintra, the fire and shouting, the hands that dragged her this way and that, the roads, the faces, the betrayals. Underneath the plain, words ran one stubborn line. North. Always north. Toward him. Geralt listened without interrupting. When she faltered, he offered a question, never a demand. When she stepped around a memory that was too sharp to touch, he let it lie. "You should never have had to live through any of that," he said when she was done. She shrugged, small and fierce. "I lived," she said, "because I was going to you." After the meal, they drifted back out into the yard. Evening laid a thin silver over the fields. Smoke rose straight up. For once there was no wind hurrying anything along. "Will you go away again?" Ciri asked, looking at the fence, not at him. He was silent for a long time. "There will be people who want you," he said at last. "Not for who you are, for your blood, your name, what you might mean. Kings, mages, others. Staying with me will not keep them away. It might bring them sooner." She thought about that, brow furrowed, the way I had seen her frown at a difficult path through undergrowth. "If I am without you," she said slowly, "they will still come. I will still be afraid. Only then I will be alone." Something in his shoulders dropped, as if he were finally putting down a weight he had been pretending not to carry. "Then you will not be alone," he said. "We stay, together. No oath, no ceremony. Just a quiet decision laid down between them like a small, bright stone. From that moment on, every road he took would have to be measured not only in miles and danger, but in the weight of the hand that would hold his cloak. That night, Jurga's house settled around us, with the soft creaks of wood remembering how to hold peace. Behind one door, the merchant and his family slept in a heap of limbs and relief. In the little room by the kitchen, Ciri curled under a borrowed blanket, already sinking into the dense, heavy sleep that comes when you finally believe, if only for a night, that no one is chasing you. Geralt lay on Jurga's narrow bed, one hand by habit near his sword, the other open and empty on the coverlet, as if it had only recently let go of something important. I sat alone at the table, lute across my knees. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a steady, quiet glow. Outside, the fields exhaled damp earth and old sunlight. Somewhere a dog barked once, and then thought better of it. The world beyond the fence was still full of armies and banners and men with plans. But in this one small house, for this one small night, two lives that should have missed each other entirely were breathing in the same safe dark. I thought of the road behind us, Borch laughing on his bridge and choosing mercy over a dragon's death. Yennefer and Istred, trying and failing to turn love into a neat equation. The Doppler in Novigrad, terrified and stubborn in his stolen skin. Essie on the stony shore, her song dissolving into foam. Brokilon listening as a witcher and a child paced around the shape of their shared future. A wagon rattling between battlefields while a half-conscious man muttered names into the dark and refused to die. We talk about destiny as if it were a single thunderclap. Looking back, I saw instead a long chain of small choices, refusals, kindnesses, stupid braveries. No prophecy by itself would ever have been enough to bring them here. What carried them was the quiet, repeated decision by dragons, by merchants, by mages, by one tired witcher and one furious little girl not to turn away from each other completely. People sometimes ask if I believe in fate. I tell them I believe in this. The way a man keeps walking toward the child he insists he does not want to claim. The way that child keeps walking toward him through a burning kingdom. The way a friend sits by a bed in a drafty cottage and refuses to leave. Because leaving would mean letting the story end in the wrong place. My fingers found a melody, nothing grand, nothing fit for courts, just a narrow tune that rose and fell like two breaths, side by side. Perhaps one day I will shape it into a ballad and let strangers sing it wrong. Perhaps I will keep it for nights like this, when the room is small and the listener close, and the soul is tired in a way applause cannot mend. If you were here beside me, I would not close this tale with a lesson wrapped in clever words. I would pour you wine, nod toward the door where they sleep, and ask you to listen with me, to a witcher's slower, easier breathing, to a child's small sigh as she turns in harmless dreams, to the faint crackle of a fire that, just for tonight, belongs to no army at all, and when you rose to go and the candles had burned low. I might lean closer and say, as softly as the end of a song, remember that destiny is not only what happens to us, but what we choose to stay for, and whose hand we refuse to let go of when the road grows dark, and the world begins once again to change its shape around us.